Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Kim Overkveld. I'm the Policy Fellow and Acting Program Manager of BASIC's Inclusive International Security Program. We're excited to be holding another expert masterclass today, this time on gender and nuclear weapons. So these EVN masterclasses are a great opportunity to tap into the fantastic network of experts that BASIC is lucky to have and to share their expertise with our Emerging Voices network. Now, as you already know, the masterclasses aim to be an accessible digital resource, primarily for our EVN members, but also the general public. And as previously mentioned, we now also have a landing page on our BASIC.org website where you will find all past masterclasses listed. So today, I'd actually like to very quickly introduce my fantastic colleague, Anita Pintilie. She's Policy Fellow here at BASIC and supporting the work of our Emerging Voices network. And she will be actually facilitating the session today and probably also future sessions. So thanks so much, Anita, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Kim. Hi, everyone. So I'm just going to kick off by introducing our speakers today. We are joined by Adina Pintilie and Laura Rose Brown. And as Kim has mentioned, they're going to be talking about gender and nuclear weapons. Adina is a program manager specialising in analysing open sources. She works to find new tools and refine research techniques which have applications for the intersection of security and social issues. She leads work on disinformation and vulnerable communities for the UK government, UN Women, UNESCO, the British Council and the OSCE. Adina is also an INTERPOL Fellow and leads Ridgeway Information's work on diversity, equity and inclusion. And Laura Rose Brown is a PhD student at the University of Leeds. Her project explores the intersection of gender and nuclear weapons, non-proliferation and disarmament. And Laura Rose is also a Policy Fellow at BASIC, where she is working to develop policy outputs that are relevant to her scholarly research. And with that, I think I will hand over to Adina. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone, and thanks so much to everyone at BASIC for hosting us today. I'm just going to share my screen, and a thumbs up on whether you can see it would be really appreciated. Brilliant. Awesome. So you may have seen from the description of the session, but today we're hoping to take you from some theory on gender and nuclear weapons to some practice. And today, we're going to be talking through some approaches to gender, and Laura Rose will lead on that and some of her amazing research on gender in a policy context. And I'm excited to share with you some of the work that we do on inclusive digital spaces. Some of it will be focused to practitioners, and some of it is some of the programming that we run that kind of focuses on different audiences. And we're hoping to end with a discussion and hear from you. We've got some questions and some ways in which our research ties together. But we really welcome your thoughts at the end so we can have an open conversation. And I guess I'd just like to say from the beginning that what we're trying to do is blend our experience as academics and practitioners and show that these communities of knowledge do speak to each other. Some of the notions and some of the themes that we're going to be covering might be really familiar to you. But as we were saying at the beginning, we're hoping that this is an accessible resource for everyone in the EVN community. So we can absolutely delve more into specifics and expertise into the Q&A, and we'll both be very excited to hear what you've got to share with us. So maybe I can pass on to Laura Rose now.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Adina. Can everyone hear me? Just to check first. Fab.
Good.
Yeah, it's great to see some familiar faces and get to come and talk about this, the project that I've been working on, and also having had the opportunity to learn about Adina's work in the last couple of weeks. So if we pop to the first slide, maybe, approaches to gender. So lots of you will be familiar with some of the following work, but I think it's important to kind of map out where the work around gender and nuclear weapons started before kind of thinking about future directions for that research trajectory. So the first thing to note is that this is not new. Whilst an area that is really underexplored academically and also in policy research, this is not a new area of research, and it's very much rooted in a very rich history of scholarship on feminism and post-colonial theory, and mainly in terms of the critiques of realist international relations theory. So in the 1970s, feminist critiques of international relations became increasingly prominent, with questions sort of around who's being secured through our security policies being asked. And through this, one main scholar of feminist security theory, Blanchard, discussed this idea of security policies being an elite world of masculine politics. A key part of this feminist critique and feminist security theory that came from that was asking why we would prioritize militarization over other more imminent concerns, such as health concerns, environmental issues, gender-based violence, things that were more disproportionately impactful on women. The critique also highlighted how militarization led to a concept of security which is partial, elusive and mundane, and that's in the words of Christine Sylvester. So when it comes to thinking about what gender and nuclear weapons and what the study of that looks like, I think the most cited work that everybody will probably know is the article by Carol Cohn in 1987 titled "Sex and Death in the Rational World of Defense Intellectuals." This piece looks at how gendered discourses made it possible for US defense intellectuals at the time to talk about nuclear weapons in the way that they did. And Cohn provides examples from very sexual imagery to abstractive terms to show how the creation of what Cohn calls a techno-strategic language allowed individuals to talk about weapons of mass destruction in abstract terms, and also talk about them in terms of the prestige they might bring to them on the international stage. So Carol Cohn's piece, whilst potentially oversighted, it's because there's not enough research in this space at the moment, it does do a lot of work in explaining how this elite world of masculine high politics functions through a gendered discourse, and how that can perpetuate dynamics within the nuclear weapons policy space. But there's also much more recent literature on this, and just in terms of contrasting that Carol Cohn's piece, there's more recent literature looking at how feminine symbols have been used to talk about nuclear weapons. So for example, in 2022, a paper published by Hebatala Taha looks at how popular Egyptian discourses in the 1950s represented nuclear technologies through the symbols of an egg and of beautiful women. And that account really shows how, whilst Carol Cohn's piece is very important and has an important place within the literature, it doesn't speak to a universal experience of how gendered discourses operate in this space. And that's interesting to keep in mind as we move forward into this, the project that I'll be presenting to you. Just on that as well, I think if we're still talking about gender now, even though that this has been talked about for many, many years in the context of international security and nuclear weapons, one of the reasons for that is because this continues to be in the policy community a very, very gendered space. And perhaps a good example of that is the work that's been done in the consensual straitjacket, which again, I'm sure most of you will be aware of, which was a report published by the New America Foundation, which brought together interviews of women in the US nuclear policy field to show how gender was having an impact on nuclear policy making and the people working within that space. So in that context, the consensual straitjacket describes how women would need to master the orthodoxy, that is, align their views with the incumbent policies of the time, which are deterrence in the nuclear space, in order to be taken seriously and do well in the field. Finally, on this slide, just want to sort of finish mapping that space by saying that in 2011, this research came out that showed, by Mary Olson, that showed the disproportionate impact of nuclear weapons on women and children. And it did that by disaggregating the data from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So that report showed both that there is no safe radiation exposure level above 0 for anyone. But like I said, the gender disaggregation showed that the ionizing radiation is more likely to harm females and women, and children in that understanding. So on to the next slide. From thinking from there and having kind of some of those aspects at the forefront of our minds, it's interesting to think about how these ideas of gender have then kind of come into the policy space. So within the work that I do with BASIC, and I'm sure within the work that lots of you are doing, we do see a trend to bring gender here. So the UNIDIR within the Disarmament Institute of Research at the UN have a gender and disarmament program fully dedicated to this topic. The United Nations Office of Disarmament Affairs now has stated explicitly its commitment to gender perspectives. There are initiatives such as the Gender Champions in Nuclear Policy, which I won't say too much about because Adina is going to come on to that, but an initiative that allows you to pledge your commitment to various goals around gender equality within an organisation in the nuclear policy community. And on top of that, there's sort of mentorship programs for young women entering the space. There's ad hoc seminars. And I suppose in many ways, this masterclass speaks to that this is now a topic that policy communities are interested in putting money into, but also learning from. So with that in mind, I'll sort of jump forward actually to the next slide to introduce the case study that I'd like to share with you all. And for those of you that might have heard about this before, then bear with me. I'll hopefully still keep it interesting. This is a piece of research I co-authored with my PhD supervisor, Dr. Laura Considine, and was published in the Journal of International Affairs as part of a special section on feminist interrogations into global nuclear politics. So in light of the developments that we've seen in the policy space that I just mentioned, and thinking about kind of scholarly engagement with this research so far, we asked, how does work done on gendering nuclear policy to date understand what a gender-sensitive approach to nuclear weapons both means and requires? So to answer this question, we took the case study of the Non-Proliferation Treaty and conducted a discourse analysis from an intersectional feminist approach to question how NPT actors understand what gender is in the official policy documents, what they think gender sensitivity means and requires, and also how these concepts relate back to the NPT as an institution and what it enshrines, and about nuclear weapons as social objects. So we took the NPT as our site of analysis on the basis that it's a central institution of nuclear weapons governance with the largest number and widest range of state parties. And given this, the NPT review conference cycles are significant in setting the tone for international nuclear weapons diplomacy. In terms of how we did the research, we analysed 49 documents within the NPT official discourse that mention the term gender, men, and women explicitly. And those documents we took from since 2015, which is when we could see a real shift in the discourse that was moving towards an emphasis on gender. So we coded those documents to see how those texts understood gender, again, what they thought, how those texts self-understood gender sensitivity, and how that was relating back to the NPT and nuclear weapons. So if we jump on to the next slide, thank you. So we found three core themes within this study. The first theme that we found was the absence of men and masculinity within the discourse. When men were mentioned, they were always mentioned in relation to women. So for example, in one statement, there was a quote that says, "Tackling the peril of nuclear weapons will require the best contributions of everyone, not just men, but also women." The documents that we studied implied that a gender-sensitive approach will bring gender to the NPT. And in doing so, that sort of suggests that the NPT is an ungendered space in the first place. But bringing a gender perspective was only explored in relation to the differentiated impacts of nuclear weapons on women and girls, and the inclusion of women within nuclear weapons institutions, gender equality, and diversity. So to this extent, gendering the NPT process becomes a process equated with bringing women in, and it's a process that is doing gender is bringing women. Conversely, we found that the NPT implies that it has been a male-dominated space by the way it constructs women outside of it. So what we have is a discourse that is both ungendered and male-dominated, and so men are both dominant in that space and absent. The second theme that we found in the discourse was the framing of women as outsiders to the NPT. So as we noted, women are prominent across the documents, and these groups of women are portrayed as critical for further progress. So in an EU statement, I think you can see on the screen, we read, "Active and equal partnership and leadership of women in decision-making and action will be crucial in achieving further progress on nuclear disarmament." There are 2 points to note around this issue of women being seen as crucial as outsiders to the NPT. So the first is it comes with the assumption that inclusion and diversity will lead directly to better policy outcomes. And of course, we don't dispute that inclusion is a meritable goal. But what we say is that that's necessary, but not sufficient in terms of really bringing gender into this space. And second, it's important to think about this group of women that have been framed as exogenous to the NPT. and why they are split out from other groups. For example, we see lists of women, civil society, and youth, and it's interesting that women are seen to represent something that would be separate from civil society and youth in that context. And on this, we sort of developed this idea that the discourse first has to exclude women in order to then include women, but at the same time as having a discourse that has an overwhelming emphasis on participation. So I will return to this point when I get to kind of some of the policy implications of this work, but I think it's interesting to think about some of the tensions there within the discourse. And the third theme that I just wanted to share with you all is this: the theme is women as being resources for peace. So as I said in the second point, you know, women are constructed as outsiders, but essential outsiders to the MPT. But it's seen that if women are brought in, this will be something that will improve the efficiency and procedure of the MPT as an institution. So as you can see in that quote there, we see when looking to break the ongoing stalemate and trench digging within disarmament and non-proliferation, improving gender aspects is not soft policy, it is smart policy. And this framing presents women as resources and gender and gendering as a solution to the problem of institutional efficiency, with various implications in terms of what that means around how women are expected to, what women are expected to bring to the MPT process and the specific line of work they will be doing within that. And so now perhaps I'll jump onto the policy implications of this. And just to note, so with my supervisor, Laura Considine, we wrote a short blog about this in terms of what this means for policymakers moving forward and what we would like them to consider in light of this research. And so the first question as we frame it is gender as efficiency to what end? So we asked the policy community to consider the implications of viewing gender and its work in its name as a means towards institutional efficiency. Pursuing gender work with the assumption that it is crucial for the MPT as an institution fails to engage with how gender and power dynamics are at work within that space already. And in this way, and in contrast to the advocacy of gender approaches to challenge the status quo, gender work in the MPT at the moment risks becoming a way to sustain status quos within the MPT institution and entrench incumbent policies as opposed to bringing change, as women are expected to do, that we see in the discourse. The second question we ask is, are women outsiders? This fails to account for the ongoing and historical contribution of women to the nuclear weapons policy space and the ways in which they've had to adapt to a masculine worldview of nuclear weapons politics. And this oversight stems from a narrow view of gender sensitivity that we found as just including women, which once again works to entrench incumbent dynamics in the space. And the final question that we ask is, who are these women? And this is a crucial question. The categorization of all women into one homogenous group is problematic. It overlooks how power and hierarchy is experienced differently, not only in gendered terms, but in terms of race, class, and coloniality. And these differences will continue to go ignored in policy terms if the assumption of sameness is maintained and sustained within this discourse. So to finish up there, sorry, Adina, I was speaking for a little bit longer than I was planning, but just to leave with a couple of conclusions. The main takeaway I think that I'd like to put on the table is that how gender's brought up and how we speak about it in the official policy discourse matters. And with that in mind, I think it's important to encourage, I do it myself, but for all of us to think and continue thinking about this in the context of the next review cycle of the MPT, but also in the context of other places of nuclear weapons diplomacy. So thinking about the second meeting of states parties for the Treaty of the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons at the end of the year. The good news is there's really interesting work going on these topics and beyond, particularly at the moment when it comes to actually bringing the feminist literatures that I've discussed earlier into conversation with post-colonial literatures. And I think that's a really interesting space and a good place to start if people are interested in this. And that's a good place to plug the special section where the article that I presented was published, but there's a number of other articles within there that look at different ways of approaching this question of gender and nuclear weapons, but going beyond gender, crucially as well. In addition to that, there are other places to start engaging with this work. BASIC has a gender and nuclear weapons bibliography available on the BASIC website, and I will drop a link into the chat afterwards. And this is very useful because it's a living document that anyone can contribute to. So if you're working on these issues or you want to know more about this work, then it's a great place to start. And it's also a great place to add resources that you've been interested in and found useful. I will leave it there. I've got a couple of sort of questions I think could be interesting to discuss once we finish both of our presentations, but I'll hand over to Adina, who's going to discuss how this work and these issues around inclusion have been approached by practitioners and some of the great work that Adina's doing in the digital space. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Laura Rose. I think there's loads to unpack later on. And I guess where I wanted to pick this up is this kind of inclusion piece and what women and how we make these spaces more inclusive. So really, my work focuses a lot on digital spaces, but first I wanted to look at broadly nuclear spaces. And again, some of you may be familiar with this, but it's always worth a plug for good causes. And for practitioners, and as someone who leads kind of internal DEI work, I thought it would be remiss to not mention Gender Champions in Nuclear Policy. And if you don't know, this is a leadership network launched in 2018. And it brings together heads of organizations working in nuclear policy who are committed to break down gender barriers and make gender equity a working reality in their spheres of influence. So once you join as an organization as part of Gender Champions, to be a part of this network, there's a couple, I think we're just shy of 100 at the moment. Organizations set themselves 3 or more annual commitments, and they follow this SMARTY format. They're worth emphasizing in this space because as someone who leads internally on DEI, and we can talk more about effective and efficient kind of internal policies later, I think this is setting a really strong message. Setting your own annual commitments helps with reporting, transparency, and implementation. There's something to be said for peer networks of support and really accountability when you put this kind of stuff out there. And one of the foundational commitments of Gender Champions is the panel parity pledge. So that is the pledge that all champions, this is the leaders of these organizations, they make this pledge to avoid as much as possible appearing on single gender panels. And in the context of making spaces more inclusive, I think this is a concrete process of kind of thoughtful internal and external exercise for the organizer and the potential panelist. But when we're talking about gender, we have to be thinking about intersectionality. And here I wanted to highlight Women of Color Advancing Peace, Security and Conflict Transformation, which is a platform devoted to women of color. And it includes a CBRN working group, which publishes expert commentary and analysis from women of color. I left that link so visibly out there, but there'll be follow-ups with all of the links that we mentioned. Really, really engaging stuff that you should all have a look at. But WCAPS also led Organizations in Solidarity, which is a partnership among more than 300 organizations and individuals across the UK, the US, and abroad. And everyone who is a partner in Organizations in Solidarity understands that racism will not be eliminated without a sustained effort. And we must work within ourselves, our organizations, and in collaboration against any and all signs of structural racism that continues to permeate our culture, society, and ways of life. And within OIS, people join something that's called the working group that usually works towards a tangible research output or kind of something practical that can be taken by individuals and organizations to spur on change. I've been doing the DEI program and the DEI work within Ridgeway for some time now, and I also thought it might be useful to kind of highlight some resources that I found useful along the way. And this is by no means an exhaustive list, but just a few shout outs to the Inclusive Scientific Meetings Guide from 500 Women Scientists, which is a concrete guide of recommendations for how to create inclusive and equitable spaces at scientific meetings. I think why this is such an amazing resource is because it genuinely focuses on intersectionality, especially for those multiply marginalized. If you want to engage with some events, really worthwhile checking out WISE, which has a really large footprint and chapters around the world. They've got an amazing resource library for a range of content that bridges the divide between gender and the security fields. There's also Women Who Know Stuff, and feel free to list yourself as part of the Brussels binder and find some more women experts. And something that Laura Rose mentioned earlier is this new focus on the pipeline. That's also a working group within Organizations in Solidarity. And it's about time we looked at this problem in a systemic way. Worthwhile, not the only one by any means, mentioning the IAEA's Marie Sklodowska-Curie Fellowship Program, which aims to help increase the number of women in the nuclear field and supportive and inclusive workforce of both men and women who contribute to and drive global scientific and technological innovation. The hope for me personally is at some point we'll move beyond the gender binary, but it does feel that some slow and tentative moves are being made in that direction. So we spoke about nuclear and inclusive spaces, and I wanted to kind of step back and look at this issue kind of more broadly. And this is where most of my research and my work sits at the moment. And I lead on work related to cyber violence. It's an increasing problem worldwide, and even more so since the COVID-19 pandemic. It's often gender-based and targeting women and girls. And I lead Ridgeway's Women, Peace and Security workstream. And I guess personally, I'm passionate about mitigating and ultimately eradicating cyber violence because it just hampers the full realization of gender equality and it violates women's rights. But what you're seeing on screen are some pretty stark facts, and they've been collated in a fact sheet from UN Women, which you can access later. But I think in these kinds of studies, the thing that really sticks with me every time is that in kind of the past 5 years, most girls report having their first experience of social media harassment between the ages of 14 and 16. And the numbers are pretty bleak. The situation is pretty acute, but I think concrete action is there. And it's extremely exciting that this year's Commission on the Status of Women focused on online spaces and tech. So if you've never heard of this before, CSW is the second largest gathering in the UN calendar after the General Assembly. It's basically like a COP, but for gender. And this year, the priority theme was innovation and technological change, and education in the digital age for achieving gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls. And to the earlier point that Laura Rose was making about what women, this year in particular, it's amazing to see in the practical output, which is captured in the agreed conclusion, a real drive and focus on intersectionality, especially for women in rural settings, women in island nation states, and those who may be experiencing online spaces extremely differently from the rest of us. So this year, the recommendations, I think, can be split broadly into kind of 6 areas. So firstly, we're all encouraged to develop digital tools and services to address the needs of women and girls across sectors, geographies, and ensure that women and girls have access to digital literacy and skills throughout their life course. Secondly, there was a focus to mainstream gender in digital policies and to remove barriers to equal access for all women and girls, again, with a focus on intersectionality. Thirdly, to foster a policy of zero tolerance for gender-based violence that occurs through or is amplified by the use of technology, and calls to prioritize prevention and elimination of cyber violence. There's a 4th focus on mainstreaming a gender perspective in the design of emerging technologies and more on protecting girls and women. 5th, more on promoting policies and programs that achieve gender parity in emerging scientific and technological fields, and also the creation of supportive workplaces and education settings. And I don't think nuclear spaces are any strangers to that. And the one that I was personally excited about was developing gender responsive innovation that challenges gender stereotypes, negative social norms, including through the development of digital content, awareness campaigns, and teaching competencies for positive engagement in digital technologies that not just engage, but educate, encourage, and empower youth, which also includes men and boys, to become agents of change for gender equality. So on this theme, I wanted to share some of the work that I've been doing on digital equity. And this is around navigating disinformation, which is a project that the team at Ridgeway and myself worked alongside with Girl Security. which is a US-based NGO, and they work to close the gender gap in national security through equity-informed learning, college to career training, and mentoring support. So together, we developed Navigating Disinformation, which is a free e-learning module designed for girls, women, and gender minorities in Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, the Philippines, Thailand, East Timor, and Vietnam. But we also have an English version of the course, and you're welcome to join us online. And we developed this course for UN women because digital literacy and cyber awareness are crucial to preventing conflict in the region. And learning constructive ways to use online spaces increases digital literacy. It protects young people from harms online. And here we're looking at disinformation, misinformation, malinformation, or hate speech. And it broadly makes them more cyber aware. So the course provides participants with knowledge about the online environment. It empowers them to engage safely online and show them ways to engage in the local community. So we set ourselves 3 objectives when we were developing the course. First, we wanted to build participants' digital literacy skills. We wanted to validate and amplify voices in online interactions. We wanted to educate participants to identify and help stop the distribution of hate speech and misinformation, and empower them to spread positive content online and champion actions that challenge hate speech and misinformation. And now this is aimed at an audience kind of 16 to 24. We actually found older people taking the course. So I think our oldest course participant is 82, who's successfully completed the course. But I left this here and I'm bringing this in because I think everyone knows someone who works in the nuclear space who doesn't feel as confident in these skills and in these behaviors. And that's because these are new spaces. Sometimes everyone is, the pandemic brought us together in these spaces in different ways. So remembering that we're engaging online in something that is heavy, big, and sometimes gate kept by really big, complex subjects like nuclear non-proliferation, it's really important. And what I wanted to highlight from the course is part of the kind of better cyber hygiene that we teach participants. And this is a fact sheet that they take away at the end of a module. And to talk a little about the think before you link. So we talk a lot about how disinformation is designed to make course participants and really all of us online feel angry and tap into our emotions. And there's a variety of activities that encourage people to think about the way that they share information, especially if it's really emotive. And I've used this to think about how this works around nuclear activism. Normally, there's a lot of strong feeling on this. So it's really worth remembering that whether we put research out there, whether we do something that we think is incredibly technical, once it reaches an audience, they may be reacting to it differently. Now, I'm not saying that nuclear debates incite cyber violence, but I'm saying that the types of behaviors that we see in people interacting online are actually pretty similar. I hope that you can see this, but this is something that we put in as one of the quizzes that are part of the course. And we kind of want to help people understand and make them aware that sometimes things online are not really what they seem. And there's 2 things that are wrong with this picture that can tell you that this really is not real. And this is misinformation because it's not necessarily doing anything bad. It's just slightly misguided. I'll give you maybe like 20 seconds so you can have a proper look at it. And hopefully it's not too pixelated and you can see it all okay. So just to show that things online aren't always what they seem, this is a mistyping of Kendall Jenner's name. And if you look in her shadow, that placard actually doesn't exist. This is just a simple kind of cyber hygiene, online behavior way to show that, images sometimes can be arresting. There's a lot of amazing work around nuclear non-proliferation and kind of open sources being used to debunk myths. And that's way more technical. But these kinds of behaviors are the things that we want to be building in young people. So when they see stuff like that seems extremely arresting, they take a step back and they think about it. So we spoke about some ways that we think about gender in academic literature and some of the work that's been foundational to our thinking. We've heard a lot about some case studies and some of the work that is going on to make spaces more inclusive. And this is where we wanted to kind of wrap up and figure out kind of what's next. So I think what ties both of our work is the fact that we need to be including more women in quite a lot of the processes that we work across, but be mindful of the kinds of women that we are all including and we're making space for. And sometimes that means creating digital inclusive spaces digitally, because we work differently and we are now able to reach different kinds of audiences, and we're able to reach our colleagues in different ways. I suppose in some ways the pandemic has helped connect us differently. It's really important for me personally, as someone who works with people in different geographies, to create these spaces and showcase that this is possible across lots of different areas of practice, because gender equity is something that we should all be striving for in international security, irrespective of the topic that we're working in. And I think for me personally, as someone who came completely outside of the nuclear security sphere, when I started working as a researcher, I was working on nuclear non-proliferation and kind of the safeguards regime in kind of a technical capacity. And I felt alone. And I know that I'm not the only person who felt like an outsider to the field. And I'm a white woman living in an able body, and I sound like this. Some things were really easy for me, but some things really weren't. So making sure that we create accessible spaces by design is something that is going to improve all of us as a field. What I'll do now is just flash our contact details, but I'll put them also in the chat, and I'll stop sharing my screen. This is all of us, all of our details here, but I'll put them in the chat in a minute as well. And I think from Laura Rose and myself, we wanted to say thank you, and we're really excited to hear your questions.
Thank you so much, Adina and Laura Rose. That was really interesting. I really enjoyed that. I think especially it was really helpful considering that you kind of contextualized these issues of gender within the wider kind of security framework, actually, you know, making clear their implications for cybersecurity, nuclear policy, diplomatic practice and whatnot. So that was brilliant. Thank you so much. And I think if it's okay with you, I might follow up and get your contact information and also some of those resources, and I can also pass them on in an email to everyone. But I think with that, we can kick off the discussion. So if you do have any thoughts, comments, questions, just feel free to raise your hand and we'll bring you in. And if you're not able to speak maybe at the moment, you can also pop it in the chat and I'll read them out for you. But yeah, let's go. Yeah, Declan, go ahead.
Hi, yeah, thank you both for a really, really good presentation. Really interesting, and yeah, big fan of both of your works. I think my main question I wanted to ask was kind of regarding how do you tackle certain like organizations or certain governments of, I guess, using kind of gender as like a tick box kind of exercise, and how to make them not try and commandeer it as a kind of, I guess, a publicity kind of stunt, and, you know, make sure that it's being done in good faith and with real detail and attention to actually dealing with the issue, rather than saying, oh, look, we paid attention to gender. So yeah, I'd like to know your thoughts on how you can avoid that or hold them to account if they do that.
Laura Rose, do you mind if I start? I love the entrepreneurial holding people to account spirit, Declan, and I think that's the right attitude that we should all be having. And I'm coming with this answer off the back of a scoping study that I led for the British Council. And one of our findings was this, that some of the governments that we were assessing, I suppose, were doing things as a tick box exercise for a category of women working in higher education. And one of the recommendations that kind of the team and I came up with that is, the things that you don't count, you don't know. And this sounds kind of boring in a sense. Count better, increase the way that you count your women. What kind of women are you including? Where are you including them? Helps people move beyond the fact that they have done some gender work, kind of digging into this and demanding, as, you know, people who get to influence policymakers and governments, helping them and kind of probing them on digging a bit deeper has been really interesting as a suggestion, kind of coming from a consultant kind of point of view, because we're helping people build things. We're not just shaming people into saying you haven't done enough. That sometimes works, but I found that constructive behavior building is a little bit more positive and a little bit more lasting change. Laura Rose?
Yeah, that's such a good question, Declan, and I think that's the issue, right? I think that's a big part of the PhD project I'm looking at is thinking about what happens when this becomes a marvelous marketing exercise for these institutions that in many ways can be deeply problematic. I think there's probably two things, and it's very similar to what Adina is saying. It did make me think of the Gender Champions Initiative because the way that commitments are formalized, there's an impact report every year. I'm not saying that means that work is always, I think it can be both. I think people can be doing good work on these things, but also using it as a way to find some sort of prestige in this space. What I also think is interesting to think about is how I'm very aware that the presentation that, for example, that I gave with looking gender and nuclear weapons, and that's still very narrow in terms of what needs to happen in this space in terms of diversifying it and making sure that it's an inclusive space. And I think there's something around expanding, moving beyond the men-women binary just in general, but moving beyond that and thinking more in terms of an intersectional approach that brings other aspects of identity into this. I think that's a way of just pushing this a bit further for organizations. I really noticed that in terms of, I know actually there's a couple of people on the call that are involved with Gender Champions as focal points. And I think one of the things I've really noticed in how the narrative there has evolved from thinking about gender to now thinking about actually a much more comprehensive intersectional approach. And I actually think with that's gone hand in hand with more progress on this. So I think sort of just slowly pushing out that way as well has an impact, but I don't have a really tangible answer for you because I really think, that's the problem, right?
Thank you. I think then we'll go to Louis and then Anna.
Hi guys, it's Roy to turn on my camera. Hello, it's lovely to see all of you and thanks for a great presentation. I am really interested in because of the research that I'm doing within one of the working groups at the EVN, but also because of a potential event that we might organize on feminist foreign policies ahead of the PrepCon meeting in Vienna. I'm really interested in Laura Rose and your perception of the issue of seeing women as a resource for peace, because on the one side, feminist policies emphasize sustainable peace over weapons and over armament, and they do make that connection between involving women in processes and them becoming more sustainably peaceful. At the same time, women in this field have said that when people have painted women as being inherently more peaceful and have made that connection, that undermines their seriousness and how seriously they're being taken by men. How to balance that, essentially? That's my question. Is there a right and a wrong way of emphasizing the peacefulness of feminist approaches to not undermine women's seriousness at the same time? And my second question is whether you have seen in your research of how the gender issue has been brought up in the NPT review process. And I think for the first time that actually happened in the last review process from 2017 onwards, whether you've seen any suggestions in working papers or side events that went beyond just saying we need more female bodies in meetings, essentially. I know that some of the additional points that have been raised have been about the gendered impacts of nuclear weapons, but that also doesn't go to the point of addressing historical power structures, addressing how narratives about nuclear weapons, disarmament and armament are gendered. But have you seen any of those suggestions somewhere and they just got lost in the process? I'd be curious to know. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Louis, and so good to see you again. On the question on feminist foreign policy, I suppose in terms of how to balance the way that the image of woman is constructed with what that image or that woman is supposed to do in this space, I think that kind of just makes me think about which feminism is being espoused through different feminist foreign policies. So if we think that now we've got 12 states that formally say that they are doing feminist foreign policy, potentially 13 now that Slovenia have announced that they'd like to do the same thing, but they all hold very different spaces in terms to nuclear weapons, all are party to the NPT. So that's interesting. But some of them are members of the TPMW. Others, France, for example, has nuclear weapons. So I think it's just interesting. I think, yeah, I'd say in terms of which feminism is being used, because I think within a lot of those feminist foreign policies at the moment, what we see is quite a liberal conceptualization of feminism. And I think within that, the issue around essentializing an essentialist image of women as peaceful is potentially less problematic within that view of feminism. Whereas if we move into sort of thinking about anti-militarist feminisms, then ultimately that's very problematic to have that there. So how to balance it, I would say, is more the feminist foreign policies that each of these states are talking about are very different versions of feminism. And I think that sort of maybe gets to the heart of why we have this tension. In terms of women as resources for peace and balancing that with peaceful women. Of course, I don't think, I wouldn't argue that it's fantastic if women can be working towards the pursuit of peace just like anybody else, but I think it's the specificity around this issue of what would it be that women specifically bring to that. And that's what we kind of want to pull out of the discourse, because what we found is that was not in the discourse in the case of men, and anything outside of a man-woman gender binary just didn't exist at all. So maybe moving on to your second point there, interestingly, and we discussed this in our article actually, is there was a paper written in 2001, and I'm going to forget who wrote it now, so I might have to go away and find it and pop it in the chat. But it used really interesting language around masculinities, thinking about how power was structuring nuclear weapons institutions. So that language has existed in this policy community before. It just got, like you say, you articulated it perfectly, it got lost. In terms of since 2017, I personally haven't seen much happening on that. At the moment, I'm working on a discourse analysis of documents in the TPMW, and there, that's a much more comprehensive space on this work. But I will, during the next round of questions, and I will have a look now to see if I can find that document for you, because I think it's really interesting to think about how these ideas actually around going beyond just talking about adding women have existed. I think they're a bigger task, and they require a lot more, and they require some very difficult questions and answers from institutions about how you can square certain types of policy with certain ways of bringing gender to this space.
Thank you so much. Anna, if you want to come in here, and then I will read some of the questions that are in the chat. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. It's really good to see all of you. I'm actually, maybe I had another question, but I just want to jump in on the whole feminist foreign policy conversation, because I'm at the moment working as at a think tank on Germany's feminist foreign policy, and the question of what kind of feminism is understood in their feminist foreign policy, as well as how it's implemented. And so if you want to chat about that some more, Louis as well, like you can also just contact me. I wanted to maybe add on that the question of who has been bringing in gender into these conversations. Maybe we can talk about this a little bit more, and like then not only how they're understanding gender, but also who's bringing that in and why. I find that really interesting. I mean, of course you looked at the NPT, Laura Rose, but maybe did you also specifically look at who was doing that, and from which position? And I would be interested bridging it to the questions of feminist foreign policy. Is there like an overlap of, for example, states who are claiming to have a feminist foreign policy, and then also trying to bring gender into different spaces, also into different nuclear policy spaces, and then how that is being done. That is one question, like more of like the who and in which way. And then, yeah, I'm thinking a lot about this whole question, how to have a gender or gender sensitive or gender critical approach in nuclear policy that goes beyond talking about women's participation and or gendered impacts in terms of different impacts of radioactive contamination, and more about which kind of knowledge production, knowledge articulations on nuclear weapons generally, and then on nuclear disarmament specifically, are we talking about, and how they're coming from very Eurocentric and androcentric knowledge systems and knowledge production. So maybe we can have another session, or maybe we can talk a little bit more about what kind of different knowledge articulations or conceptualizations of how we think about nuclear weapons, what nuclear weapons are, how we relate to them, and where do these assumptions and concepts are coming from. Like, I'm personally very interested in more of these like knowledge questions of knowledge production and how they've been gendered and racialized as well. I'm not very good at having like a specific question. I'm so sorry about this.
No, that's fantastic. And thanks so much, Anna. It's great to see you again too. I think when you ask the question around who is doing this, I think like a really interesting way of looking at that is thinking about who funds a lot of this work. So one of the aspects in the presentation we think about is that various actors within civil society are starting up programs on this work, and they've been state funded. Canada has been a big funder of this work, Norway, trying to think, Sweden. So I think in terms of who's doing it, my answer is that there are some big players in nuclear politics doing this, but those players also have a very, like I mentioned before, a very specific place within the global nuclear order at the moment. Canada relies on the extended deterrence of the US. That's not insignificant, but it also does have implications in terms of the limits and the parameters of what their gender work could look like, I think, and what it wouldn't be able to do. And so I've just written down your questions, but so thinking about the overlap between feminist foreign policies and the discourse there and the discourse within the NPT, part of me wants to say watch this space. I'm currently working on a policy paper that speaks exactly to that interaction, that takes the feminist foreign state articulations of feminist foreign policy of the 12 states that formally articulated it, and takes that in the context of the RevCon, the 10th NPT RevCon, and thinks about how we see ideas of feminist foreign policy coming into an NPT discourse, and vice versa, what the NPT discourse might tell us about feminist foreign policies. Spoiler alert, we still have a really big emphasis on this issue of participation. And I don't think discursively we're much closer to resolving the tension between discussing these gendered impacts and thinking about women's participation, but going beyond that. So there's work in progress. I'd love to have a chat with you about it. So that'll be fantastic. And in terms of the question of different knowledge articulations and some of the assumptions underpinning ideas around nuclear weapons, but also ideas around gender. I think, so the special section that brings together post-colonial and feminist perspectives, I think that's an interesting place to start. I think there's a lot within the collection that thinks about the coloniality of nuclear weapons, and I think that's a great place to start from. I can't pretend to be an expert in that by any means, but we'd be more than happy again to have a conversation and think about where's places to start looking.
Amazing, thank you so much. And then in the chat we have a question from Irene, and she is asking, what is a way of avoiding checklist exercises when they are seen as negative? Sometimes women, young people, or other groups are invited to the table, but it's expected that they follow the point of view that's been provided to them rather than being able to show their own agency. So how can this be avoided, especially regarding young women?
I think that's such an amazing point to raise. Thank you so much for bringing that in, Irene. I think from my experience, I've worked with quite a lot of UN Women officers, and my favorite thing that I've heard someone young say was at this year's CSW, and an activist said, "Nothing about us without us." And I think the crux of that, for me at least, is creating spaces that are mindful and meaningful. So there's ways in which you can bring people into a room and say, wait, what do you think about this? Or you could be conducting things like deliberative research. Give people prompts, give them all of the information that you have, and they actually will come up with different solutions to your problem because they're bringing different experiences. Now, those kinds of things, kind of moving beyond that checklist of we included women in this process, we also included 5 young people, therefore it is inclusive. To me, that also speaks to the way that we fund things. And to Laura Rose's point earlier, it's really important to recognize people for their work. And this is why I think these inclusive spaces need to kind of see all of these identities. If we're, for example, looking at young people to interact with, or young women to interact with our nuclear policies, and we're having this kind of community workshop, depending on the community that we're working with, they might be people who have the main caring responsibility for their families. So have we budgeted the fact that they will need to find childcare or take a day off work? And are we giving them the financial, compensation for this time? So I think even the fact that we're thinking about avoiding checklists and holding ourselves accountable when we kind of find ourselves finding and making a checklist is useful in and of itself. But for me, it boils down to making sure that the places are meaningful and people are able to come to them fully.
Sorry, my mute button just ran away from me for a second there. That was really interesting. I think that's also quite an insightful bit of advice as well for a lot of our early career people who are going to be listening to this and looking for maybe some of the things that they should look for when opportunities come their way, to make sure that it's an equitable, accessible opportunity. I will come to Louis. I'm going to be very selfish and maybe throw in a question of my own first, if that's okay. I am really, really interested, you spoke, Adina, about digital spaces, for example. And I look a lot, I'm quite interested in spaces, like in the nuclear field, diplomatic structures are how the NPT, these treaty mechanisms, that kind of thing work. And, as you've mentioned, a lot of it's about the participation of minoritized communities, bringing these people in, making sure the opportunities are there. But, one of the other obstacles is once we get them in the room, those spaces themselves still have a long way to go. And I was wondering whether you had any thoughts on that, or maybe, you can see any tangible solutions and steps forward for some of these spaces, for example, the NPT and that kind of thing, and whether that would have any implications for nuclear policy.
Gosh, hitting nail on the head there. Wow, thanks, Anahita. From my experience with kind of being in those spaces and trying to create them, and I am looking forward to seeing the day when all of nuclear spaces feel like this, is having people be championed and genuinely following those ideas. So for example, creating, a space for people to be able to come and discuss a policy, making something tangible out of it and following through and holding yourself accountable if you are the person who's created that space. I think that in the nuclear community, we tend to hide behind acronyms and really long words. And I think that the second we start making things simpler and we allow people to challenge us as knowledge creators, it starts to become easier to make the spaces better because people can feel like they can come up with questions and we're not going to feel offended when they ask something as simple as, what do you mean? So my experience of successful spaces that have been inclusive actually have been around things like sexual violence and health and reproductive health. And I have seen firsthand how incredible it is when people who are kind of at the top of their organization kind of go, I've listened to you. I don't really have to listen to you, but this is going to make our work so much better. So I am going to hold myself accountable to you, and you can come back with really simple questions. And it is amazing how transformational that is. And I actually, on your question, I wonder, Laura Rose, whether you think that this is the kind of thing that is possible and it will happen, especially, you know, with things coming up in the nuclear space.
I think so. Yeah, I think so. I mean, this question around what that question kind of brought up for me was, I was just thinking about how practitioners, well, how we interact around these questions. And I was just thinking about what Twitter looks like right now in terms of engaging in questions around various opinions on nuclear politics. And yeah, I think we've got a lot to learn in the space around accessibility and what's the word? Engaging in good faith, maybe. I think there's like a lot of work to be done. I think the people that are willing to do the work are not always the people that actually need to be doing all the work. So I think that's like a challenge that we'll always have in this space, but that kind of comes back to some of these more entrenched dynamics in the nuclear policy community. But yeah.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Louis, come in.
Thank you. In the research that I'm doing in the EVN policy cycle, I was mainly interested in how diversity actually affects individuals and how they feel, think, and interact, and how that shapes work outcomes. Because as you've said, Laura Rose, we talk about including women in the NPT review process as something that can increase productivity or effectiveness, but that's sort of a black box assumption. We don't really look inside that box and think about how does the presence of diverse people actually change how people interact with each other. So I'm really curious, because you said that diversity is kind of a necessary but not sufficient condition to actually realizing those positive benefits. What in your research have you found to be the sufficient conditions? So when you have more representation in those spaces, what do you then need to do to actually unlock these positive effects of diversity?
I'm going to give an annoying answer now, because we just don't know, because we don't know. I think we need to kind of, there's a step back moment that says, you know, we rely on this idea that diversity will bring X, Y, Z things. And I think there's a need to kind of interrogate. We don't have an evidence base of what it might deliver. I think it sounds really interesting what you're researching in terms of what that means for the individual, though, because like that seems to me a gap in the research that would allow us to start actually plugging that gap, right? And saying, well, we know that for individuals, and this has an impact in certain ways, and they're able to perform their work in different ways, produce different types of work, that then might allow us to start thinking about that jump, because there's a jump in this kind of theory of change, right? It's like, we need to make this more diverse, and by doing that, things will, well, let's say within the NPT, things will improve in process, or we might move closer to a world free of nuclear weapons, but the middle piece doesn't actually exist. And it's not to say that it's not there. I think it's very difficult to articulate. And the way that diversity and participation, diversity and inclusion is approached at the moment in a very, it's an umbrella, but it's not comprehensive. So it's this sort of surface level at some level. That's why we don't have that piece in between. But yeah, on the necessary but not sufficient point, I think that's, just thinking about, coming back to the issue of the tick box exercise, it's not enough to say you're just including more diverse perspectives, because we need to think about what that actually means for this space. And I think that's where maybe we get to these bigger questions around how these dynamics actually structure the space and actually completely constitute it. I don't know if that answers your question. It's But I'll leave you with that.
Thank you. Is it okay if I quickly respond to that, Anahita? Or okay. I don't want to make this about a presentation of my research, because that's not what this event is. But I think you really hit the nail on the head there, that in this space, and when we talk about increasing DEI and nuclear weapons policymaking, we're not aware that there is a whole body of research from behavioral science and psychology that talks about empirical findings about how people think and interact differently in diverse teams versus homogenous teams. And there's this this kind of baseline assumption that we make that's kind of been popularized by management consulting firms like McKinsey, that just kind of says you have diversity and that increases effectiveness. And teams that are diverse perform better. But then we kind of I think that kind of thinking leads to proposals in the NPT review process where we say, well, we need to add women to the process, but we don't think about what comes after that. So once these women are at the table, what happens? Well, hopefully some of those findings that I've written about make it into the policy paper. You can then read about them once the paper is published.
I'd love to just jump in. That sounds absolutely fascinating. And yeah, I think this makes me think a lot about, I was reading recently, and again, I'll be able to send the paper to you if it's of interest. I was reading a lot about just gender mainstreaming in general, and where this phenomenon of doing gender mainstreaming came from. And it's interesting to think about how it kind of came up at the same time as diversity management. As, like you say, something that was a HR program normally in a corporate space. And I think it kind of there's a really interesting piece of work to be done to think about what is specific about the nuclear weapons policy space, and how does that then link to this diversity? So yeah, I'm really looking forward to hearing more about your policy paper.
Amazing. I'm a little conscious of time, but I do have one very tiny question. I think it builds on something that Louis has touched on as well. Once we diversify, we bring these people in, what actually happens next? I was quite curious, for example, you've mentioned feminist foreign policy. In the current security context, we've seen Sweden, who has, really committed to this idea of an FFP, but they have now angled for NATO membership. They're in the process of pursuing that, within the invasion of Ukraine. We're at an all-time high with military spending again, hyper-militarization, that kind of thing. So alongside all of these strides, we're still seeing people go back to basics, as it were, with these very traditional approaches to international security practice and foreign policy. And I was curious if you maybe see it as an obstacle or an opportunity for progress, if there are ways to progress it, that kind of thing.
I'm happy to jump in here if you're, yeah. So I suppose that so first and foremost, a state's feminist foreign policy is what they decide it is going to be for them. And I think that's kind of important to keep in mind. So interesting that Sweden renounced its feminist foreign policy and then made this, it was all part of the same pivot, right? So that seems to be at some level an acknowledgement that, well, it's an implicit acknowledgement that those two things couldn't be squared together, which I think is interesting. I'm going to lose myself here because I thought I had a good point, but I might not. On opportunities, one of the kind of interesting streams of research, or at least ways of thinking about this that I think is interesting at the moment, is how feminist foreign policies relate to women, peace and security agenda. And when we think about that in relation to what the women, peace and security agenda means for nuclear politics, and one of the big challenges is it's become mainly focused on the pillar of WPS around women's participation, right? So I think it's interesting to think there seems to be a lot of overlap between what feminist foreign policies are expected to do and how they're going to do it. And countries' national action plans on their women, peace and security agenda and the women, peace and security agenda more broadly. So I sort of think there's certainly opportunities in there somewhere, but I do think that another way of kind of thinking about this is to what extent feminist foreign policies are a way of restating a commitment to women, peace and security in new terms. That the extent to which that's true or not, I don't know, but I think it's an interesting way of looking at it because there seems to be a lot of overlap. So that makes me think there are a lot of opportunities, but there's a chance that this could also just turn into a bit of a reinvention of the wheel. And I think, we have to scrutinize the fact that if it's possible to have a feminist foreign policy and have nuclear weapons, and it's also possible to have feminist foreign policy and completely renounce nuclear weapons and be part of the nuclear ban treaty, what that term then does and means kind of needs to be called into question, not least for the sake of public dialogue on these and thinking about raising the nuclear IQ and thinking about, we're talking about these issues in a very sort of niche space, but what does it mean for anybody to talk about feminist foreign policy in those terms? Yeah, that's what that brought up for me.
And if I could just add on to that, I love the fact that Laura Rose just mentioned, we talk about these abstract spaces. We work a lot in the abstract, and it's really easy to forget that this is about people's lives. I have had the absolute honor to serve communities who are directly impacted about things that I used to write about in a theoretical sense, and they don't really care about using big words. So I think the fact that Laura has just said that there's all of these large expectations on kind of national women, peace and security agendas. I've spent my past year steeped in kind of policy documents and feminist kind of national documents that say that women are so put at the center of countries, and then interviewing these women who are supposed to be at the center of everything, and they've really had very different experiences. So my one slight concern is that we'll get lost into making these amazing spaces in theory, and when we get to practice, we kind of just forget that these are real people and we're working with different people, and we should be, I think, putting people at the core of our work, even if sometimes that's really scary to think about, especially kind of in the aftermath and the context of the kind of work that we do sometimes.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I think that in the interest of time, and I know that probably everyone else has meetings after this and that kind of thing, we can wrap it up there. But thank you so much, Laura Rose and Adina, for joining us today and for sharing your expertise on gender and nuclear weapons from theory to practice. I hope that this has been as enjoyable and interesting and thought-provoking for everyone else. And I will make sure to pass on all of those resources and your contact information, because I think quite a lot of people are really keen to let this conversation go a bit further. Thank you to those of you who have joined us live today, for your questions and for being so engaging. And thank you to everyone who might have joined listening to the recording virtually. Have a good day to you as well. We hope that you can join us for our next masterclass, which will be on May 10th on the third nuclear age. And until then, I will extend this recording to you once it's ready to everyone on the call, and have a great rest of the week. Thank you so much.